folks, Dr. Robert Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. Now this is, I'm going to do a video today on vitamin D toxicity. Now this is a video that I have put off making for a long time. There's been a lot of videos made about vitamin D toxicity recently on YouTube, and there is a lot of information on the internet, and I was trying not to get drawn into it. I think a lot of the information is hyperbole, and I think there are a lot of scare stories surrounding this. But I thought if I do a video to explain some of the biochemistry and some of the physiology of vitamin D toxicity, it might bring some balance to the conversation. That's not to say that my information is better than anybody else's. I've just tried to stand back from this because I felt that when this first started to become popular in the mainstream, there was a lot of misinformation, and I felt that sometimes it's better to wait for that to settle down before you provide some of your own information. So this is going to be some background information. It's hopefully going to be something that you can use to educate yourself, so that when you look at and read other articles, you'll have a better understanding of what the background to this situation is. This video is therefore related to vitamin D toxicity, and in particular I want to address the interaction between vitamin D with vitamin K and vitamin A. But before I do that, I'm going to have to fill in some background. I'm going to have to talk about some other mechanisms of vitamin D toxicity. First thing to say is I need to tell and inform you about the metabolism of vitamin D, because this is very important. Vitamin D is available in the diet, and vitamin D is available in the diet as vitamin D2, which is ergocalciferol, and vitamin D3, which is called cholecalciferol. Now really both of those dietary sources are absorbed, and I don't want to get into the nuances about the differences between them because I've covered that on another video, and there's information on my blog about that. But they enter a common pool. They're absorbed by chylomicrons along with other fat. Those chylomicrons are passed around the tissues. Some of that vitamin D is absorbed to places like adipocytes. Some of it may enter skeletal muscle. But most of the chylomicrons ultimately end up in the liver. They're broken down, and the vitamin D enters a common pool where it is hydroxylated. And at this point, it can also be mixed with the vitamin D that is synthesized in your skin, which will be of the vitamin D3 kind. And this vitamin D3 and vitamin D2 in your liver is a common pool. It's all hydroxylated, so that means an OH group is added, and at this point it becomes 2,5-hydroxy vitamin D. This is then packaged into the vitamin D receptor, the vitamin D binding protein, and it passes out into the blood. Now, that's the first hydroxylation step of vitamin D, and it's the 2,5-hydroxy vitamin D at this point that is measured as your vitamin D levels. So if you have your vitamin D blood levels tested, what they test is your 2,5-hydroxy vitamin D levels. And this is made up of 2,5-hydroxy vitamin D, which will be bound mostly to the vitamin D binding protein. The 2,5-hydroxy vitamin D can subsequently be hydroxylated again in the kidney, and then it becomes 1,2,5-dihydroxy vitamin D, which is also called calcitriol. Now, calcitriol is really the biologically active metabolite of vitamin D. Calcitriol is able to pass into cells, and when it gets into the cells, it passes first through the cellular membrane, then through the membrane that surrounds the nucleus. It binds directly to vitamin D, to DNA, and when it activates the DNA, it causes the synthesis of proteins. Now, these proteins can have many different cellular effects. and not all of them will be known. There'll be some proteins that I'm sure will be discovered in the future. But the physiological effects of vitamin D are really down to the binding of this calcitriol to the DNA in your cells, which causes the production of proteins. Many of them will be enzymes. They will cause reactions to happen in the cells, and that will change the regulation within the cells, and it will change your physiology. So that's really how vitamin D works. Now, all of the forms of vitamin D can be further hydroxylated. They can be trihydroxylated. There are hydroxylating enzymes in many tissues, and there are many vitamin D metabolites. There's 2,5, 2,6 dihydroxyvitamin D, for example. There's 2,4, 2,5 dihydroxyvitamin D. So there are many different types of metabolites of vitamin D, but those are the three main ones. One of the end products of vitamin D metabolism is called calcitriol. That's another vitamin D metabolite, and that may have some physiological effects as well. But really what we're looking at is the absorption of vitamin D, or the synthesis in the skin. It passes to the liver. It's hydroxylated to 2,5 hydroxyvitamin D. It's hydroxylated again in the kidney to 1,2,5 dihydroxyvitamin D, which is also called calcitriol, and it's that calcitriol that has cellular effects and changes cellular regulation. Now, one of the effects that vitamin D has through calcitriol is it increases blood levels of calcium. And what you tend to find is that when your calcium levels in your diet are very low, there is an increase in the synthesis of this calcitriol. Calcitriol will pass to the pass around in the blood, and it will. One of the things it will do is it will lock onto receptors in the enterocytes of your gut, and it will increase the absorption of calcium from your gut. So if you've got low calcium intake, your body reacts by trying to increase the absorption of calcium from your gut. Another thing calcitriol will do is it will pass to the kidney, and it will cause the kidneys to reabsorb as much of the calcium from your urine, or from your plasma before it becomes urine, in order to be able to maintain as much calcium in the blood as possible. And lastly, what calcitriol will do in order to increase blood levels of calcium is it will pass to the bone, and it will cause the bone to give up some of its calcium, and that will help raise blood calcium levels as well. So that's the main physiological and traditional role of calcitriol in the blood. It's really there to regulate calcium levels. But recently in research, we found that vitamin D and its metabolites have far more physiological effects than this, and they're currently being identified, and there's a big increase in the interest in vitamin D and what physiological effects it has. But that's the traditional role for vitamin D. It's to increase blood, its metabolite calcitriol increases blood levels of calcium, because if your calcium levels in your blood fall, they go too low or they go too high, that's actually quite dangerous. Most biochemical parameters in your blood need to be within a range, and one of the roles of calcitriol is to maintain calcium within that range. Now, this leads us on to one of the toxic effects of vitamin D. Traditionally, the toxic effect of vitamin D was related to its metabolism of calcium. If you take in more vitamin D, it was thought that you increase the absorption of calcium. This increases blood levels of calcium because you have more calcitriol being produced, and it was thought that this increase in the blood levels of calcium were the main reason that you had the toxic effects of vitamin D. The problem with this theory is that you can have the toxic effects of vitamin D without having raised levels of calcium, which indicates that the raised levels of calcium may actually be, rather than being the cause of the toxicity, they may be an effect. And this is what's currently being researched, and it looks like this may actually be the case. That's not to say that the raised levels of calcium won't have damaging effects, but it looks like they're more likely to be an effect of too much vitamin D rather. It looks like they're more likely to be, rather than being the cause of all of the toxicity of vitamin D, it looks more like that they're another subset of effects that are occurring, and that can be measured. So really, when you look at the toxicity symptoms of vitamin D, there is this raised levels of blood calcium. That's the traditional thinking that this was what was causing the problems. But you also get other effects, like mainly neurological effects. You get growth retardation. There is anorexia, so laboratory animals given too much vitamin D will lose a lot of weight. They will have nervous problems, and ultimately they'll die. It's relating to growth, it's relating to differentiation and this nervous activity. And this really can't be explained simply by elevated levels of calcium in the blood. In fact, even the calcification of soft tissues like blood vessels can't really be explained by the elevated levels of calcium in the blood. I know that seems counterintuitive, but the mechanism is not there. So this is what's led researchers to look for other mechanisms, because there's a lot of lines of evidence to suggest that simply raising the calcium levels in the blood, which we call hypercalcaemia, which you probably come across when you're looking at the symptoms of vitamin D toxicity, this hypercalcaemia can't explain all of these detrimental effects. So I'm going to talk about two other current theories that may explain some of the toxicity that's associated with taking in too much vitamin D. Now, the first thing to say before I explain these mechanisms is that you can't get a vitamin D toxicity from going out into the sunlight. You produce a lot of vitamin D from sunlight exposure, but it doesn't cause toxicity, which is quite interesting. The only toxicity comes from taking a dietary source. So the first bone of contention here really is that no one knows how much vitamin D you should have in your diet. If someone tells you they know the correct amount of vitamin D that you should take, I would take that information with a pinch of salt. Researchers are very interested in this, and there is a range of doses that have been recommended, but those are based on individual researchers' information, and they're not there isn't really a consensus. Clearly the early recommendations to have 200 to 400 IU of vitamin D, that's enough to stop you getting rickets or osteomalacia, which are the traditional calcium-related deficiency diseases associated with vitamin D. But that's not enough to cause optimal support to your immune system. And because there are new physiological roles for vitamin D being identified all the time, what's happened is that the recommendation for the amount of vitamin D you should have in your diet has slowly increased. And, current recommendations are somewhere between 2,000 IU and 4,000 IU. But no one really knows. It may be higher than that, it could be slightly lower than that, and it will also depend, of course, on how much sunlight exposure you get, and also it will depend on other nutrients, which is something we're going to come to a little bit later in this video. So that's the first thing to say is really, a lot of this information is still within research. This research is ongoing, so some of this is guesswork. Now, the first, it's talked about hypercalcemia and how that can't really explain all of the toxic effects of vitamin D. So another theory that was suggested was that the toxicity of the vitamin actually comes from an interaction between the 2,5-hydroxy vitamin D, which is the vitamin D that's produced by the liver, and the 1,2,5-dihydroxy vitamin D, the calcitriol that is in the blood. Now, to understand how this interaction occurs, what need to explain is that hydroxylation increases the water solubility of a compound. So if we take vitamin D, for example, the parent compound is not hydroxylated. So it's the most lipophilic compound of all the vitamin D compounds. In other words, it likes being in fat tissue and doesn't like being in water tissue. When that vitamin D is hydroxylated and a hydroxyl group is added to it, it increases the water solubility somewhat. If you hydroxylate it again, you increase the water solubility again. So calcitriol is more water soluble than 2,5-hydroxy vitamin D, which is more water soluble than the parent compound vitamin D. So one of the hypotheses that has been put forward is that when you take in too much vitamin D, what happens is your vitamin D levels go up and your 2,5-hydroxy vitamin D levels go up. We know this because these can be measured in the blood, and you can have a simple vitamin D test. But because those compounds, particularly the 2,5-hydroxy vitamin D, are more fat soluble, they're more lipid soluble, they have a higher affinity for the vitamin D binding protein. And this relates to the chemistry of the molecules. Now, the vitamin D binding protein normally transports many of the different vitamin D compounds around in the blood. But one of the things it does is it acts as a way of taking 1,2,5-dihydroxyvitamin D, the calcitriol, out of circulation. If it's bound to the vitamin D binding protein in the blood, it can't have a physiological effect. One of the theories is that the 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D produced in the liver, as you take in more vitamin D, levels of that will increase. We know that it can be measured. That will then bind to the vitamin D binding protein in the blood, and it will knock the calcitriol off the binding protein. This increases the pool of free calcitriol in the blood, and it's that pool of free calcitriol not bound to the protein that actually may have the ability to get into the cells and have the cellular effect. So by increasing your intake of vitamin D, what you're effectively doing is, although there is a regulatory mechanism in your body that stops too much calcitriol being produced if you increase your intake of vitamin D, what actually may happen is, unfortunately, the 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D has a preferential affinity for that binding protein. It knocks the calcitriol off the binding protein, and therefore, although your calcitriol levels haven't increased, there is more calcitriol available to go into the cells because there's more free calcitriol, and that then will change cellular regulation and have cellular effects. That's one of the hypotheses that's been put forward, and there is evidence for that. There have been case studies where people have accidentally consumed too much vitamin D. Their vitamin D levels go up, their vitamin D intake increases, their 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D levels also increase, but their total calcitriol levels in their blood don't increase. However, when you analyze the calcitriol and where it is, there's a higher proportion of the calcitriol in its free state compared with how much is associated with the binding protein, and that therefore might be one of the reasons why vitamin D becomes toxic as levels increase. So that's just something that I've noticed is not really talked about, and it has been researched, and there is some evidence for that. So far we've got, it could be something to do with the hypercalcaemia that's caused by increasing vitamin D levels, and it could be that there is more available calcitriol to have cellular effects. And this brings us to the last hypothesis that I want to talk about. And there are other hypotheses regarding vitamin D toxicity. These are just the three main ones that are in the research. The other hypothesis that explains vitamin D toxicity relates to vitamin K and to vitamin A to a certain extent. What's thought to happen is that when vitamin D levels increase, you get an increase in the production of 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D, and this causes in some way an increase in the 1,2,5-dihydroxyvitamin D, which may be via the mechanism I've just explained. It may be because there's more free calcitriol in the blood, and therefore this calcitriol can have a regulatory effect on cells, and one of the cells that it may affect is the bone tissue. Now what might happen is that if you remember at the start of this video, I said that the calcitriol gets into cells, it binds to the DNA, and it forms proteins. Now, there are a group of proteins within bone that are produced by this binding of calcitriol to the DNA in your cells in your bone. However, for activation, they require a protein that is it needs to be carboxylated by a vitamin K dependent process, and as the production of these vitamin D proteins increase in your bone, you require more carboxylation because they are all carboxylated in order to be able for them to become active. Now, what effectively happens is, as you produce more of these proteins, you require more carboxylation, which requires more vitamin K. You slowly deplete your vitamin K levels in your tissues. And this may happen in other tissues as well. Bone is perhaps the one that's been studied, but there are these carboxylating enzymes. Vitamin K is really a substance that is intricately involved in carboxylation in the body. And it may be different forms of vitamin K are required for different types of tissue. For example, it's known that the carboxylation that occurs in the liver preferentially occurs because of phyloquinone, which is vitamin K1. However, the carboxylation of other proteins that occurs in other tissues outside of the liver preferentially uses vitamin K2, which is menaquinone. Now, menaquinone is produced in your gastrointestinal tract by bacteria, whereas phyloquinone will come from your diet in, for example, green leafy vegetables. They're a good source of phyloquinone. So it may actually depend on which tissue and where this carboxylation is required as to which form of vitamin K you require. So there's another level of complexity there. But generally, as your vitamin D intake increases, you will produce more proteins that require carboxylation, and those proteins, that carboxylation process is a vitamin K dependent process. So as your vitamin D levels go up, you start to deplete your levels of vitamin K as the metabolism of vitamin K, the turnover of vitamin K increases. This is one of the the downstream results of this is that you end up with a vitamin K deficiency. So this is where vitamin K and vitamin D interaction ends up. Vitamin D toxicity could be, and certainly in some cases, linked to a vitamin K depletion or a vitamin K deficiency. Which is very interesting, and really the biochemistry of this is not fully understood. But are there any lines of evidence for this? Yeah, many of the effects of vitamin D toxicity are very similar to what you would expect to get from a vitamin K deficiency. That's a reasonable line of evidence. And there are other lines of evidence that have used vitamin K antagonizing drugs, and those have very similar side effects to, for example, the vitamin D toxicity. But a lot of this has been done, all of this work really has been done in animals, because it's not possible to do, ethically, it's not possible to do this kind of work in humans. So there's been the odd case study that have looked at, nutrient interactions where people have accidentally taken too much or too little of a particular vitamin, but really you can't, it's very difficult to get the ethical approval to do this kind of work on humans. So obviously most of these studies have been done on animals, and therefore that should always be taken in context. But there is good evidence that vitamin D toxicity is caused by this depletion of vitamin K, by the production of too many of these proteins that require carboxylation. And this carboxylation process is really a vitamin K process. So you increase as you increase your level of vitamin D, you increase your requirement for vitamin K in the diet. So that's very interesting. Now, where does vitamin A come into this? Well, vitamin A is another vitamin that may interact with vitamin D, because what vitamin A does is it actually inhibits the production of some of these proteins. If you inhibit the production of some of these proteins, this is probably at the DNA level. Vitamin A is also really a hormone. It acts as a hormone. It binds directly to the DNA. There is an inhibition of some of these proteins that are normally produced by vitamin D. So if you increase your vitamin A levels, you decrease the production of these proteins, and therefore you decrease the reduction for you decrease the requirement for carboxylation, and that decreases the requirement for vitamin K. So you're sparing some of your vitamin K. So that's where vitamin A fits into this this trio of nutrients and how they interact. That's really a very, very brief overview. Taking out most of the biochemical names, that's one of the theories, and it fits very well with the previous theory, because how does the calcitriol level increase? The calcitriol level may well increase because as you increase your vitamin D intake, what you're effectively doing is knocking off the binding protein and making it available to cells. It goes into the cells. It increases the production of certain proteins by binding to the DNA. Some of those proteins require carboxylation. That carboxylation is a vitamin K dependent process that uses up your vitamin K. If you increase your vitamin A intake, that inhibits the formation of those vitamin D proteins, and therefore you don't need so much vitamin K. So vitamin A can actually protect from the toxicity of vitamin D. This is really what's being discussed, and I want to finish this video by bringing some context to this. Firstly, I want to say that this is not new information. It's been known for 50 years or more that vitamin A will protect against a vitamin D toxicity. There are reports going way back, and I've certainly read them, of people doing experiments where vitamin D toxicity was inhibited by taking high amounts of vitamin A. So firstly, this is not new information, and the interaction between vitamin D and vitamin K has also been known for a long time. People have made observations that the vitamin D toxicity symptoms are very similar to vitamin K. It's just that because they didn't have the molecular techniques that we have now, they couldn't explain the mechanism. That doesn't mean that it wasn't observed and nutritionists haven't known about this. It's just that only recently have we've been able to go into cells. We've got all these molecular techniques now that allow us to measure particular things within the cells. So the nutritionists of the past didn't have those techniques, but they still made the same observations. Vitamin D toxicity is very similar to a vitamin K deficiency in terms of its physiological changes and symptoms. And high vitamin A intakes are protective of vitamin D toxicity. So that has been known. The other thing to say is that many people are suggesting that you can take as much vitamin D as you want as long as you take vitamin K. And I think this is where really I've tried not to make this video, and I've tried to hold back on making it, because I've been very consistent on my website and in my videos that I believe taking individual nutrients is not a good idea. All nutrients interact with other nutrients. I can't think of a single nutrient, a single vitamin or mineral that doesn't interact in some way with another one. If you start taking high amounts of single nutrients, what you tend to do is you end up on the path to disease. You should never take high amounts of calcium in the absence of other divalent cations, particularly magnesium. Sodium and potassium, two minerals that are intimately linked together. The omega-6 fatty acids balance with the omega-3 fatty acids. Vitamin D balances with vitamin K and vitamin A. Zinc balances with copper. All of these minerals interact with one another. All of these vitamins interact with one another, and you can draw web diagrams of how they interact, and it's incredibly complex and it's not really fully understood, and you only got to change your intake of one of them to put the balance of all the others out. And this is really where I want to leave this video and say that this is about sensible supplementation. The amount of vitamin D you require in your diet is not known. It's probably somewhere for an adult, in the absence of sunlight, between about 2,000 to 4,000 IU, but that will depend. There is some suggestion that you can take more because all you need to do is make sure you have adequate vitamin A or vitamin K. And there is no toxicity of vitamin D because it's really a deficiency of vitamin K. And I think this is where you need to be very careful, and I think this is where there is a lot of hyperbole. You shouldn't have a vitamin K deficiency. You should have enough vitamin K produced by your gut bacteria and in your diet, such that if you took 2,000 to 4,000 IU of vitamin D, it wouldn't cause a problem. What we're really talking about is taking excessive amounts of vitamin D, which is very high amounts. So more than 4,000 IU for a long period of time. Some people, I've read recommendations for 10,000 IU. Now, that's not to say there aren't specific conditions that require that amount of vitamin D, and as long as they're accompanied by blood tests to make sure that your 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D levels and other metabolites, perhaps by measuring calcitriol as well, are maintained within a particular range, there's nothing wrong with that. But you've got to be very careful about taking vitamin D on its own, and you've got to be very careful about assuming that if you take vitamin K with the vitamin D, then there's not going to be any toxicity symptoms, because really this is not fully understood yet. What is understood is that if you take a population of people living in high latitudes in Western populations, they tend to be vitamin D deficient. In the absence of sunlight, most people in developed countries become vitamin D deficient if they're not aware of nutrition and they're aware of supplementation and what foods they're eating. If you supplement those people with between 2,000 to 4,000 IU, it brings up their 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D levels within what is now the recommended range, which would possibly be somewhere around upward of 40 nanograms per mil, which is equivalent to 100 nanomoles per litre. That is somewhere about where you would need your vitamin D levels, perhaps higher than that, but somewhere around there would give you an optimal immune function. It's assumed that when you take that amount of vitamin D that you have also assessed the other nutrients that you require. And this is where I think I have the problem with this, because it's assumed by many people that they're just going to take vitamin D. I would never recommend that at all, and I would never recommend that you would take somebody off the street and just start supplementing them with vitamin D. Vitamin D is something that is used as a tool, but it has to be used as a tool with other tools, and it should be assumed that that person has a good quality diet, and if not, they should be recommended to eat one. And it should be understood that they would have adequate vitamin K. With a normal diet and with normal healthy gut biota that are producing vitamin K, studies show that taking that amount of vitamin D, 2000 to 4000 IU, it does not cause toxicity symptoms. And that's really where the recommendation should be. That's a sensible, balanced amount. Vitamin A recommendations, if you're eating a healthy diet and you're taking a multivitamin, I don't think that you need to worry about your vitamin A levels. There's usually enough vitamin A in a multivitamin to satisfy your needs. There's a certain amount of beta carotene that you get in your diet as well. And so with a healthy diet, that range of vitamin D, it should be fine. There's no reason why you should become vitamin K depleted at that amount. In fact, you're going to produce more of these proteins, some of them which are involved in bone formation, but some of them are involved in the immune system. And as long as you've got a healthy diet to go with it, as long as you've got adequate levels of all of the nutrients, that 2000 to 4000 range of vitamin D is really going to be fine. I think a lot of this conversation has come from people who have higher recommendations, or people who are using hyperbole to claim that vitamin D has toxicity that it doesn't have. If you're worried about vitamin D, the best and safest way to go about vitamin D supplementation is to take your supplement and get a regular blood test. And as long as your blood levels are around that 100 nanomoles per litre, 40 nanograms per mil area, you're not going to get any toxicity symptoms, assuming that you have a good diet and you've got adequate vitamin K. And there's no reason to assume that you would have a vitamin K deficiency if you were eating a good quality diet, and as long as you weren't taking antibiotics that had killed all of your gut bacteria. In a normal healthy person, that amount of vitamin D would be fine. And therefore that's still my recommendation. I know people say that I don't recommend enough vitamin D. I've had some comments that say that I don't recommend vitamin K with vitamin D. So this video now clarifies really where I'm coming from, in terms of the fact that firstly, we don't really know, so we have to use ranges, not amounts. And secondly, everything in balance. Most of the nutrients should come from food, and I've always said that you should always try, where possible, to get your vitamin D from sunlight. You should only take supplements where you don't have access to the sun. So anyone that lives near the equator, or where they've got good sunlight all year round, you don't even need to worry about vitamin D supplements. You don't need to worry about vitamin D in your food. You'll get all the vitamin D you require from the sun. In the summer months at high latitudes, I don't take a vitamin D supplement. You produce tens of thousands of IU of vitamin D from your skin anyway. So really, we're only talking about the winter months, and we're talking about quite small amounts of vitamin D, 2000 to 4000, but it has to be in balance with other nutrients, including vitamin K and including vitamin A. And if you have that balanced diet with those supplements, and you only take them for 6 months of the year, and you take them at sensible ranges, there's no need to worry about vitamin K. There's no need to worry about vitamin A. There's a lot of scare stories out there about vitamin D toxicity. If you're worried, and I've always said this, make sure you get a regular blood test to measure your 2,5-hydroxyvitamin D levels. And as long as they stay in that range, if they're low, you take a little bit more. If they're high, you take a little bit less. And that's the best and safest way to do it. Always work with a health professional, and always work with somebody that's got the qualifications and the knowledge to be able to understand what's actually happening with you on an individual level. This video is not meant to diagnose or treat anybody. This is just for information purposes, so you can go back to your doctor, and then you are now in a more informed position to be able to give him some information to be able to ultimately get where you want to go with your health. So I hope that was interesting. I will put the links to the 2 papers about the vitamin D deficiency in the comments box below this video. So for those people who want to do some more reading, they will be able to look at those papers. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please invite you to subscribe. If you did find this video interesting, a thumbs up would be very helpful. And I will see you soon for another video. As always, eat well, stay healthy, and protect yourself.